Welcome to the Aspen Institute's Hearst Lecture Series program featuring Melody Barnes and John Bridgeland in conversation with Steve Patrick. I'm Crystal Logan, Vice President of Aspen Community Programs and Engagement here at the Aspen Institute. And I first want to thank Bob and Soledad Hearst for making this series possible. Thanks to our audience for tuning in for this important conversation. As I introduce our guests today, you'll find links to their bios in the chat, as well as other important information throughout the event. If you have questions that you'd like to pose to our speakers, you can type those into the Q&A feature anytime during the event. Melody Barnes is co-director for Policy and Public Affairs of the Democracy Initiative at the University of Virginia, where she also serves as Professor of Public Affairs and a Distinguished Fellow at the School of Law. She served as Assistant to the President and Director of the White House Domestic Policy Council under President Obama. She was also Executive Vice President for Policy at the Center for American Progress and Chief Counsel to the late Senator Kennedy on the Senate Judiciary Committee. John Bridgeland is founder and CEO of Civic. He is Vice Chairman of Malaria No More and also Vice Chairman of the Service Year Alliance. He was appointed by President Obama to serve on the White House Council for Community Solutions and by President George W. Bush to serve as Director of the White House Domestic Policy Council and Assistant to the President of the United States. Steve Patrick is Vice President and Executive Director of the Forum for Community Solutions at the Aspen Institute. He served as a senior program officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and a Vice President at the Daniels Fund. We are thrilled and honored to feature you all here today. With that, over to you, Steve. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Crystal. What a privilege and honor to be able to moderate this conversation with two fantastic patriots and civic leaders, and both former heads of domestic policy, John Bridgeland under President Bush, Melody Barnes under President Obama. It's going to be a great conversation. I don't want to talk much more than to say, I wish we were in Aspen. That's why I chose the photo from Aspen behind me. And next year, maybe we'll get to do this in person. I picture us all in Pepka having this conversation in person some other time. Meanwhile, let's jump in. And I think before I ask you some questions, I know, speaking of other patriots, John Lewis passed away this past Friday. You both worked in Congress. Melody, you worked many years for Senator Kennedy. Bridge, you worked with Rob Portman when he was in Congress, and now he's in the Senate. I wonder if we might start, and Bridge, I'll start with you. Just any memories you want to share, or as we recognize we lost a lion in this country, any reflections as we mourn the loss of Congressman Lewis?
Thanks, Steve. And I just want to say it's so great to do anything with you and Melody Barnes. It's exactly the kind of effort we need across the country, cross-party, cross-sector. Yeah, John Lewis, as I think about him and his legacy, which is so well known, he understood what it meant to treat other people with dignity. I think because he had witnessed its absence. And, Congress is a pretty hierarchical place. When I was a young chief of staff, I think I was serving the most junior member of the lower house of Congress. Not a vaulted position, but we worked to craft something called the Drug-Free Communities Act, and with Congressman Stokes, the National Underground Network to Freedom Act. And it seemed like everywhere we worked, Congressman John Lewis was in the middle of the action. I loved what he stood for so much for things. But of all members of Congress, he was someone who actually knew your name and wanted to know something about you, and always asked the question, I'll never forget it, have you walked in their shoes? And so just 2 years ago, I had the opportunity to testify before the Ways and Means Committee. He was on it. He showed up for the hearing. I was so glad, because often you testify and people don't show up for the hearing. And he asked me the same question, have you walked in their shoes? And we had this wonderful exchange. And the thing that touched me more than anything is he came up to me after the hearing, and it had literally been 25 years since I was on the Hill. And for even a lousy Republican like me, he treated people with such dignity, remembered my name, and just represented such love and compassion. And you know, we have a thunderstorm here, and it's rumbling pretty hard. And I think that must be John Lewis saying, "Go further, go faster, do more to affect a real change in this country." So we lost a great one, but he's still with us.
Thanks, Bridge. And Melody, any reflections on your end? Any thoughts about Congressman Lewis?
Well, first of all, like Bridge, I want to say thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this conversation, and with two of my favorite people. And I know often in DC, people say things like that and they don't mean them. I think you both know that I do. We've had the opportunity to work together many, many times. So it's great to be in conversation with you. When I think about John Lewis, I have many of the same kinds of reflections that Bridge does. I got to the privilege of being in his presence and to work on voting rights issues and other civil rights issues with him and with his staff, and to observe him. And he was a great man who also had great humility and great integrity. And I also reflect on the fact that without his sacrifices, without his work, my life wouldn't be this life. He literally made the opportunities that I've had possible. I was born in 1964, and his work for the Civil Rights Act, for the Voting Rights Act, for the Fair Housing Act, and so on, transformed my life and the lives of so many people in this country. And in thinking about him, I went back and I was looking at something, it's short, but I want to share it with you. They're words that he wrote and that he read about 11 years ago after the death of a friend of his, another member of Congress. And I think they're really appropriate to remember him. In some ways, they echo what Bridge was saying about him. So using his name, Congressman Lewis had a heart full of grace and a soul generated by love that never forgot the spark of divinity that runs through us all, no matter whether you were his closest friend or his fiercest adversary. A brilliant light has gone out that uplifted not just America, but the entire world community. The spark of light that he gave to each one of us still burns brightly, and it is our duty, our obligation to continue his legacy and pass that light on to unborn generations. He will be deeply missed, but not forgotten, and his legacy will live on in all of us.
Beautiful. Thank you, Melody. Let's use that to talk about his legacy and to get your take on current events as in the domestic context. It was clear that John Lewis, one of the last acts he did was go visit the Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington, D.C. He expressed a through line from his work all the way back to when he was the president of Student Nonviolent Coordinating Council and SNCC. He saw that through line. There is this moment now in our country that we're all witnessing of uprising, triggered by the murder of George Floyd. I'm curious to hear both of your takes on how you are interpreting this sustained protest, and what would you hope we could achieve in this country that could come out of that action that we're seeing across the country. I'm curious to hear both of you. Mel, why don't you start, and we'll go to Bridge. Thank you.
I look at this period and I think that it reflects the best of American democracy in ways that we've also seen across our history. Because every day we are provided the opportunity to determine who we will be as a country and as a society and as a people. And while elections are absolutely necessary, we were just talking about John Lewis, absolutely necessary, but they are not sufficient. We have to think about the hundreds and hundreds of days that happen in between elections and the ways that we act on those days to shape our country. And so when I think about history, I think about these moments, the non-election moments that we reflect on and that we remember, that because they were so transformative. And when I think about the reaction to George Floyd's murder and the fact that we witnessed that globally, I know that that will be one of those moments that's transformative for this country, because there have been years and years of organizing. There have been years and years and years of agenda setting and the desire and the will to build capacity inside organizations and to do movement building. But at the same time, those moments created this well-plowed, fertile land upon which fell a national and a global reaction of horror and anger when people watched that 8-minute and 46-second video. And it became almost impossible, and I say almost because some still do, but almost impossible to refute the fact that there is a hierarchy of human value in our country that we've seen generation over generation, 100 years over 100 years. And people, I think, as was said during the civil rights movement, were sick and tired of being sick and tired. And so those things came together, the planning, the organizing, and this moment where so many people across races and ethnicities said, enough, enough, we're not doing this anymore. And so I've seen the fruit of that organizing and that capacity building, and we see it with the young people that we all have worked with. I've seen it through the electoral process where city councils were changed, state general assemblies were changed. There are efforts to do so going forward in the next election, as well as the benefit of philanthropic work, work by some in the private sector to come together and to address that enough, we can't do this anymore. And my hope is that that will be sustained over a long period of time, that we won't grow weary of it, that we won't, quite frankly, grow bored with it, avert our attention to something else, become sick and tired of the discomfort that it must bring, and that we will stick with it so that we can bring about the kind of change that's necessary.
So you're optimistic that we're moving from a moment to a movement and this will be sustained. I'm curious, Bridge, if you have thoughts about this moment and what's possible now as we always seek to strengthen the American experiment.
So amen to Mel, and I love the op-ed she wrote recently. But I'd say I'm inspired, really inspired by the millions of nonviolent protesters who were seeking, community by community, neighborhood by neighborhood, real, permanent, systemic change in the spirit of King and Lewis and many others who set the example when I was growing up in the 1960s. And, I think about John Lewis's comment, have you walked in their shoes? And the honest answer is no. But I can walk by their side. And I was privileged to walk by the side of other Americans who were protesting from all backgrounds, all races, all ethnicities, in this understanding that what links us is this divinity that Melody talks so beautifully in that letter she read, this common spirit of common humanity. And I guess what I'm hopeful about is, can we turn these eruptions, and they should continue, and I hope they'll be dramatic, into sustainable change that truly is embraced by a diverse group of leaders and communities of all backgrounds, including both those who don't feel part of communities and neighborhoods threatened by law enforcement, to the rank and file police officers who aren't actually given much of a voice either. And so interestingly, I had the privilege of working with Martin Luther King III when I was in the White House, and his team called me to discuss how we could envision a collaboration that wouldn't be another national commission, but a ground up effort from communities to look at systemic racism and re-envisioning public safety in the 21st century. And so we've worked actually with a team of extraordinary people, and I've always get advice from Mel and try to rope her into any effort we're working on. We've created something called Act Now that is going to go deep into 12 communities that represent the diversity of America, from Chicago and Atlanta to Martin County, Appalachia, Kentucky, to Wind River Indian Reservation in Wyoming, to talk to the disenfranchised, the vulnerable, the fearful, also to give voice to rank and file police officers and reformers who see a better way. And I think ultimately, to answer your question directly, in talking to T.D. Jakes and Rick Warren and the King, Martin Luther King, people who are driven by faith, I actually think it's going to be the faith community and other leaders that recognize this common divinity in every human being. And when we can get away from paramilitary measures of arrests and crime and move more toward community building measures, coffee with a cop, breaking bread with people of different backgrounds and neighborhoods, that will create a very different vision in community. So I'm optimistic, but I'm also mindful of this has been happening for generations. And it's just so remarkable to me in the modern age that we're still in this place. So guided by Mel, by John Lewis, by many others across America, my hope is the eruption will result in some kind of meaningful systemic transformation.
Yes. So Mel, did you want to jump in?
I just wanted to add something, thinking of listening to Bridge, and he was talking about the different communities that he has been working with, that he has marched with. And one of the things that I think is important about this moment, and it is something that young people, young adults in particular, are leaning into, is the intersectionality of what's happening. That people recognize that I may not, as Bridge say, I may not have walked in your shoes, but I can walk by your side. And I've seen it here. I live in Richmond, Virginia, and the folks that have been in the Black Lives Matter movement have been supportive of those from indigenous communities, from tribal communities, and similarly with the LGBTQ community, that people recognize that their fates rise and fall together, and that there is a real power that comes when different movements start to bond together. And I think it's also something because we're friends, we know each other's work, and we've worked together, that we've seen as those who care about issues of climate are also working with theirs who care about criminal justice, for example. So I think that is something new and something that also gives me hope, and that will fuel this movement, even though, as Bridge alluded to, hundreds and hundreds of years are a really long time to wait for the kind of change that we need. Not to say that progress hasn't taken place, but the kind of change that we need to achieve real equity in the country.
Terrific. And I think, Bridge, you spoke to moving from demilitarizing the approach. And that speaks to the White House in some ways. And I think, or in many ways, as folks who have worked and served in the White House in this moment, especially as it relates to COVID-19, what would you, if you were in your old roles as heads of domestic policy, what would you be telling a president right now? What would your advice be about the moment we're in? Go ahead, Bridge. You start, please.
Yeah, I guess I'm the Republican. I should have some advice. So I wake up every morning to this headline that we don't have a national plan, and governors like Larry Hogan and Andrew Cuomo and many people of good, Asa Hutchinson, and are longing or desperate for national leadership. COVID is a global pandemic. It merits not only national but international collaboration. And we have such extraordinary, I had the privilege of working with Tony Fauci on malaria over the years, and such extraordinary people at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And these kinds of crises with this kind of national and global reach is exactly what the federal government was built to do with authority and power. So I would say to the president, the president, the administration, three specific things. First, messaging. A study just came out, I think this morning, showing that if Americans did three simple things, washing, masks, and social distancing, we could flatten the curve on COVID and get back to reopening the country. And yet, if we're not setting the example of wearing masks and being clear to every governor and every educator and every superintendent, every business leader, that we need to take these simple but really important steps. Not just, I envision a mask saying, love thy neighbor, because it's not about just protecting yourself or, oh, government mandating me to do something that I have a freedom not to do. It should be the spirit of love thy neighbor. I'm actually doing this to protect other people. Tom Frieden just produced a wonderful piece on 15 common metrics that states ought to be gathering and acting upon, and they're not doing it. So if we actually had 5 common metrics that every single state adopted, and then we could show progress state by state on how they were doing, I think that would make a difference. And then a third, of course, instead of undercutting funding from the Congress, we need to be getting funding from the Congress for states for testing, contact tracing, PPE, healthcare workers, and particularly in the states like Florida, Texas, California that disproportionately have the most COVID. So I think the good news is we have Tony Fauci and people who across 6 presidents have been, on AIDS, SARS, Ebola, just extraordinary leaders. And we need leadership from the White House to ensure that it's not all on the backs of the governors.
Melody, I'm going to take a risk and assume you're ditto plus, but please.
Yes, and a couple of things to add to that that I think align with what Bridge just said. One, we know the elements, testing, rapid response, masking, social distancing, a measured phase back into normal, whatever our normal will look like. And obviously the drug development, whether they're drugs to help mitigate the disease, and certainly a vaccine. The problem is obviously that we're not doing enough of those things, and we're not being told and modeled to, as a country, what to do and how to do it. And Bridge spoke to those things. So if I were working in the White House, one of the things I would say, and this aligns with something Bridge would say, is that one of the most powerful tools that any president has is the power of the bully pulpit. Presidents have called us to do difficult things in the past, and the country has responded. Michelle Obama said to kids, eat healthy, exercise. And I cannot tell you how many places I traveled around the country where little kids would say to me, Michelle Obama told me to, eat my broccoli. So I'm going to eat, and literally. So there is the power that comes from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And that needs to be used for the benefit of the country. Secondly, and this may sound really, really boring, but process matters. And quite frankly, this was a concern that I had from the period of the transition all the way through now, that because of the size and the scope of the federal government, that there's a process, and Bridge knows this, I know he knows it, because when we were coming into the White House in 2008, 2009, we talked to the Bush team as we were going through transition about the kind of process that allows all the expertise to get to the table, that allows for the best decision-making process possible, that everyone is informed, and that you've got the best execution possible. And right now, we don't have the kind of process, and we've seen it in other instances, that allows for that, for data, for evidence to be absorbed into the system, to be shaken, to be scratched on, to be evaluated, for decisions to be made in an orderly fashion, and for execution to come out on the other end. The other thing that I would advise the president to do is to think about public-private collaboration. And we've seen that to great effect in many instances. One of the most interesting, important, innovative things that we've done, for example, was the creation of DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Administration, and that's 60 years old. I mean, that was after Sputnik. And that brought together the government and the private sector, worked across sectors, and a lot of things that benefit our everyday lives have ultimately kind of shaken down as a result of the kind of work that was being done there. And my point is that working across sectors will allow us to come up with solutions to the kinds of challenges that face us. While the private sector and academia are working toward a vaccine, how are we going to get those vaccines into bodies? I mean, literally, what does that process look like? What needs to be produced? You know, how do we think about the chain of production and the chain that allows for people to receive the healthcare that they need? So bringing the private sector and the public sector together, again, in a thoughtful and organized way, I think would also be something I would advise a president to do.
Great. And Bridge, you may want to add to that, because Melody segued us into a great next question, was what would you tell the new administration? You know, it's too soon to tell whether that's a second term or a Biden administration, but you know, I think Melody just hit on a bunch of those ideas. Are there things you would add to that, Bridge?
Yeah, honestly, I think there's been so much damage to the presidency and our institutions of democracy, unfortunately, that I think a new president's actually not just going to have to lay out his agenda, but actually set a different tone and take some really important interim steps to restore public trust. I mean, Bob Putnam's coming out with a book, The Upswing, and you know, part of it will show we have the lowest levels of social and institutional trust in generations. And ultimately, the country and the democracy functions when you have trust. So I would advise the new president to establish a regular cadence, I think, with the press and be honest about where the country actually stands on COVID and our economy and you know, no fake news, no spin, but straight talk. You know, I was thinking back when John Kennedy, you know, the horrible decision to go into the, you know, the Bay of Pigs fiasco, and he went out in the press, he admitted the mistake, and Ted Sorensen came in a few days later and said, you know, your polls are through the roof because you were honest with the American people. I think the second thing I do would, as president, establish a regular cadence where you invite the Speaker of the House and the Majority Leader to the White House every week, and they won't agree on everything. There'll be politics, there'll be, you know, difficult times, but just to build trust in a sense that, you know, the two branches of government are actually working effectively. My third idea was that, and Melody really touched on this, we actually need a DARPA for the private sector. And a new model of leadership. It's a big country with extraordinary people and institutions for COVID on health, education, and business. It's interesting to me, business leaders, you know, they're the ones that are actually setting the example and leading the way on masks, from Walmart and CVS and Target to the Business Roundtable. And so I would take an approach where the model of leadership is not me, the president, but we, the people, and make that concrete by not telling the American people just what government and the president are going to do, but actually by inviting in and tapping the ingenuity and creativity of the American people to tackle problems. You know, I'll just share a quick story. I had this extraordinary experience growing up in Cincinnati of having a next door neighbor named Neil Armstrong. And he was actually a quiet, humble, reclusive man who didn't, I don't think, like the public affairs mission after he came back from being the first man on the moon. But we had dinner, and he told me the story of how Kennedy just set a decadal goal, and that when he said it, the country had no idea how to pull it off, but it unleashed 400,000 engineers in the United States and around the world to actually collaborate to meet that goal. And that's the spirit, and I know Mel and I talk about this all the time, that we want to try to unleash in the country, maybe through a DARPA, private sector DARPA, but why not set bold goals, issue 10 big ideas that unite, and let the American people and its institutions innovate around them to affect change. To me, that would be a better model of leadership than what we hear today from the president and others every 5 minutes.
Yeah. I think about, Bridge talked about Kennedy and Neil Armstrong. Bridge, like, I want to come and investigate your neighborhood from your youth. Neil Armstrong lives nearby.
You're welcome anytime.
But I think about, that beautiful speech that Kennedy gave, and he said, we don't do it because it's easy, we do it because it's hard. And there's a calling to this sense of who we are as Americans, which I'll get to that in a second, but the sense of innovativeness and ingenuity and hard work and creativity, and that, we can do it. And we need someone to model and speak to us in that way. But in addition to that, to create the opportunities across sectors for us to work that way and to work collaboratively. Because the other thing that happens when we do that is that we learn about each other as individuals and across sectors. And that starts to help us knit ourselves together. And I won't say re-knit, I will say knit ourselves together for the first time. And that is one of the other things that I believe will be important for us going forward. We are literally continuing to tear ourselves apart. And there are substantive policy responses and issues that sit there. The level of inequality in this country, the divide that is yawning and is just pulling us apart, and the sense of hopelessness that crisscrosses geography, race, ethnicity, is a significant problem for this country. In addition to that, this issue and this question of American identity and what that means and how that has been defined historically, how people want to seemingly define it now, but the necessity for us to literally build the big tent, to see ourselves, our humanity reflected in one another. And there is an important role for the president to play and that bully pulpit to play to address those issues, again, using the bully pulpit, but also policy. Other things that I think also quite practically, after the next election, we will still be in the midst of COVID. I don't want it to be that way. I'm sure everybody who's listening today, I am tired of being in my house. I love my husband. I have a nice house. I want to leave it. And, we're watching travel films. I'm like, oh yeah, remember that. But the reality is that given where we are on all the issues we've discussed, we will still be grappling with this after the election. And it is important for the next president or for any administration to wrap their arms around that fact and to do the kinds of things that the experts, the scientists that Bridge and I have been talking about this afternoon. But in addition to that, what lessons are we learning from this particular experience? And what does that tell us about national preparedness? What does that tell us about our public health system? What does that tell us about the built environment? What does that tell us about access to healthcare? There are a whole series of issues that are being exposed. And we have to think about that now. It's too late to get the mulligan on this one, but shame on us if we don't take this experience and build appropriately going forward.
That's great. Bridge, I can see you want to jump in.
I was thinking, I just love Mel. I'm so glad I know you want to leave your home, Mel, but I'm glad you're sticking with Marland. That's good. It's a test of us all, right? So it's interesting that 18 months ago, this incredible person, Tim Shriver, who is chair of Special Olympics and President Kennedy's nephew, called me and said, what if we did a deeper analysis of the country's social, political, and civic nervous breakdown, and actually talked to theologians and futurists and people in communities and people who are fearful and desperate and vulnerable. And so it's sort of 18-month effort to do that. And out of it emerged this sort of transcendent insight that sounds so simple, but is so powerful. So instead of viewing Melody Barnes is a Democrat and John Bridgeland is a Republican, and people based on their race or ethnicity or being a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew. What if when you first look at another person, it's the thread of common humanity, and you don't stigmatize or stereotype or have a label in your mind with respect to that person? I think actually that's what public policy has been missing, and Tim calls it the, not religious, but the spiritual element of social change. And that if we as individuals, through social and emotional development, cultivation and interaction and rites of passage with people who are different from we are, I think we could move to a much higher level of evolution in our lives, but also that public policy would be far more transformative than the tools that we pull and tug on today. And so the cool thing for me is Melody and I have the privilege of working on this effort called Unite Together. And it's not only drawn Republicans and Democrats and people of all faiths and backgrounds, but the former presidents have been so inspired by that, 72% in the country are an exhausted majority, and they want a different path than what we're seeing today. And so I was so encouraged that, the President Bush and Clinton and the presidential libraries and all connected to this effort. And Mel and I are working something called the Great Reset. And who knows if it will be successful, but there's certainly an appetite in the country to move together instead of dividing us apart.
Fantastic. It's interesting to hear you both touch on the multi-sector, cross-sector strategies that we can all take on to tackle the challenges that we're dealing with right now. Also interesting to hear a thread of good government. If anything tells us you can't drown government in a bathtub right now, it is a pandemic. And so, I'm encouraged by the idea that we are moving towards a place where government will trust the experts, will recognize the needs of our broader citizenry. And I want to ask you to both speak to some more of your current work. It's fascinating to hear about the Unite effort, Bridge. And Melody, I know this cross-system, cross-sector stuff is important to you. I think when you left the White House and joined us at the Forum for Community Solutions at Aspen, you said, I'm not giving up on government. But I wonder if you could speak to that. And a lot of folks have been sending questions about equity, so we can maybe weave that in, policy shifts that create more equity in our country. One of the big questions that several folks have already used the chat to share. And so I think if Melody, if you would build on what Bridge has shared, he's working on right now in real time, share a little bit about the Forum for Community Solutions work. And maybe we can also drill down on Opportunity Youth, building on that, as you both have a passion for that. You both just put out a piece in the Hill, which we can send a link to. But Mel, tell us about the work you're doing right now, how it's centered at Aspen, and how it addresses these questions of equity and fairness and opportunity.
Sure. Well, the work, and Steve, you know it better than anyone because you serve as the executive director, in addition to being a vice president at the Institute, but the executive director of the Aspen Forum for Community Solutions. This is work that builds upon an effort begun in the White House under the auspices of the Domestic Policy Council. Bridge was on a council that we put together that Patty Stonecipher led, and it included business leaders and heads of philanthropy and nonprofit leaders and others who came together to understand why certain communities are more successful than others at solving these big, tough, gnarly social issues, but not wanting to examine that in a vacuum, looking across the challenges that face the country and recognizing those at that time that we refer to as disconnected youth, 16 to 24-year-olds who weren't connected to the education system or to the labor force. What communities were doing in that regard, and how could we do better? So you fast forward through the fantastic report that they submitted to the president that required government to do work, but also the private sector, the nonprofit sector, and others. And our decision that we wanted to house the continued effort at the Aspen Institute. I was smart enough, they say a smart person does, the first thing they do is find smart people or people who are smarter than they to surround themselves with. So Steve, Patrick, and Monique Miles came on board to work with me and Michelle Jolin to start to build this at the Aspen Institute. And since 2013, we have been able to not only focus on the smartest ways that we can support and influence community-based change and community-based collaboration in the various forms that it takes, but also very specifically to work with scores of communities across the country. First through an incentive fund over 24 urban, rural, and tribal communities that are helping to build pathways for opportunity youth. And Steve, to your point about equity, one of the things that we said from the very beginning was that issues of equity had to be at the center of the work that we're doing. We weren't going to dodge it. We weren't going to stick our heads in the sand. We weren't going to pretend like that isn't important. So we began to build these collaborations or partnerships with collaborations across the country, every region of the country that was working on these pathways, and to benefit from smart things that were happening in government, to build partnerships with the private sector. There are a number of CEOs and their HR chiefs who have come on board to help us train to work with community-based organizations to support young people, and really importantly, to work with young people themselves, no longer called disconnected youth, but opportunity youth, to recognize their leadership, their vision for themselves, their vision for the community, their desire to engage and to be engaged, and to have them at the table with us as we develop policy solutions, practice change, and to build capacity in communities to help them progress along these pathways, get the education that they need and want, and onward to jobs that are family wage sustaining jobs and careers.
Bridge, we only have a couple minutes left. Do you want to build on that? You were on that White House Council. You caught fire. You wrote a paper about a bridge to reconnection for young people. I think we could actually share that in the chat. You become a passionate advocate for both opportunity youth and your lifelong advocacy for national service. And I think you're working on both of those all the time. What would you add to Melody's summary of this deeper work in places?
I think it's been one of the more successful efforts in terms of results, and you can point to really dramatic results. So congratulations to the extraordinary work, Mel. And Mel brought me into the White House Council. So privileged to serve her and President Obama on this council. And you know, government tends to act upon populations instead of first listening to them. And Judy Roden, who's the head of the Rockefeller Foundation and on our council, made that point early on in one of our meetings. And so we actually went out and surveyed what were then called disconnected youth, and discovered that they were actually extraordinarily hopeful. They had big dreams just like other young people. They knew that education and work were actually vital to their success. And one of the things I loved about the survey finding is that 70% of them, it wasn't just about them and their careers, 70% wanted to volunteer in their communities and serve their country, and only 3% were doing so because of all the barriers. And I got to thinking that, you know, we don't have rites of passage in this country from youth to adulthood. You know, government doesn't ask much, the country doesn't ask much of us, pay taxes, maybe serve on a jury. And that's why I'm so compelled by the idea of as young people come of age, they do a year, there's a common expectation and common opportunity to do a year more of national service. You don't have to wear a military uniform to serve your country. You can serve in City Year. Like my son actually started City Year San Jose yesterday, and is already, you know, full of stories about the diverse group of people with whom he's working, and the community in which he's working in local roles. Mel talks about equity, you know, it's and COVID has cracked it open even more. just devastating to learn that. I often wondered, why is the high school dropout problem not on the national map back in 2004? And it's because most students and most families were experiencing schools where the graduation rate was already 90% or more. But there's a subset of about 2,000 schools in this country where the graduation rate on average is 40%. So imagine going to a school and it's disproportionately students of color and low-income students, who literally more than half the class is not even graduating from high school. And so think of the culture and climate of those places. And so I think in opportunity youth are disproportionately in them. But what you, Melody, Monique Miles, and the people surrounding you have done on opportunity youth, so changed from disconnected youth because they themselves were hopeful, is just extraordinary, going from 6.9 million disconnected opportunity youth down to something like 4.4 million. Those numbers will swell now because of unemployment and COVID, but because of your efforts in the infrastructure and the smart way in which you fostered public-private partnerships, it's a sea change on a really important issue that has generational effects. So hats off to you guys for all you've done.
Bridge, perfect for us to try to stop you from singing our praises so we can pivot to questions from the audience. What a fascinating conversation. I wish we had 2 more hours, but let's bring Crystal back in and let's hear what folks are asking from out there in the land of the internet. Thank you both very much.
Indeed, thank you both so much for a really inspiring conversation. Our first question is, do you think that the idea of American exceptionalism is helping or hindering our progress on a number of themes, from racism to effective public health care to international relations? And if so, how can that be changed?
Well, I'll jump in and start and say this is actually something that I've thought about quite a bit. I mean, without question, there are exceptional things that we have done as a country. And there are exceptional and talented people who have been here, who are born here, who have immigrated here. And that is why we have been such an innovative country. At the same time, I think I think we have to step away from a mythology that allows us to only see ourselves through rose-colored glasses and doesn't allow ourselves to understand not only our history, but the circumstances in which we exist today. And for example, I think about, I also teach at the University of Virginia, and oftentimes I was in one of my classes and a student was talking about the American healthcare system, the best outcomes in the world. And before I could say anything, when another student who had been taking a class on healthcare raised her hand and said, well, actually, our health outcomes, in terms of mortality rates, in terms of children who are infant mortality, mortality for maternal health, a whole host of issues lower in the United States than in other places in the developed world. If you are wealthy, this is a very good place to be sick. If you are not, it can be a very challenging place to be ill, and lack of access to healthcare or preventative care. And the list goes on in that way. So what I would hope is, while at the same time having pride in who we are, that also spurs us to be realistic, to look at data and evidence, and to want to do better, and to recognize that we have the capacity to do so.
I just say quickly, I love this country and love its foundations, its constitutional government. It's the mystical notion of a pursuit of happiness with a capital H is not just about me or Mel or an individual right, but a cooperative enterprise that we help one another achieve, and that I have to worry about the person who's homeless or vulnerable or disadvantaged or starving for there to be true happiness within me and within our community and country. Having said that, I'll be very direct. I think American exceptionalism, that term is arrogant. And that as we move, I'll never forget President Clinton came and spoke at City Year's 25th anniversary, and he said the new word is going to be interdependence. And we pitch our tents on different ground, but if we don't recognize our common humanity across borders, across background and differences, and learn from one another and innovate from one another, I think we should be an exceptional country that is exceptional in quietly and humbly, and also has a spirit of, there's so many things that we can learn from other people. When I went to Africa, I expected in some ways to be giving so much. And I came back and was totally transformed by the spirit of happiness and depth of dealing with conflict and poverty and starvation, and yet having a certain transcendent happiness. And so I think we have to open ourselves up and stop talking about American exceptionalism and be quietly and humbly so proud and happy for the gifts that this country brings to so many people.
Thank you. Our next question is, how do you understand the fundamental feelings of President Trump's base? And how can the divide in our country possibly be bridged? To quote the author George Saunders, there is a significant group that feels that the culture hates me.
You're looking to me, aren't you, Mel? So it's interesting. I think we have to do a lot more listening. I'll never forget getting to know J.D. Vance and listening to him speak to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting at an event. And someone stood up and said, you know, it's interesting to me. We hear about Trump's base, but they're actually 26% of Black Americans and 23% of Hispanic Americans, and went through sort of a litany of people who, you know, and again, I don't like the generalizations, but who were supporters of Trump. And J.D. Vance said, go talk to them and try to understand why they are supporters of Donald Trump. And so I think it'd be interesting to do a lot more listening. And I have neighbors who still support Donald Trump. I have extended family members who voted for Donald Trump. Some of them are, you know, questioning that vote. But I think, one, there's a lot of anger, unemployment, this sense of nostalgia. You know, when you read President Kennedy's Profiles in Courage book, he sort of discounts the notion in the foreword about how the old days were better than the current times. And I think President Trump tied into that with, you know, make America great again. Let's go backwards to be great again. And it resonates with people who are out of work, people who feel like they've been disadvantaged, a culture that they feel like has taken advantage of them. The other thing I think that strikes a chord is he speaks his mind. He's not politically correct. I was in a taxi cab in Kentucky, and I asked the taxi cab driver who what he thought, and he said, "Oh, I love Donald Trump. He doesn't let anybody, give him no guff." This stuff that, like, he stands up to the Chinese and to foreign powers and does things boldly that other presidents have been politically frightened to do. But I think he's created such a culture war and divide in this country that even those voices, as we listen to them, too often are full of hate and fear and many of the instincts that aren't our best instincts.
I would add, in some ways, this also ties to the first question. I think one of the things that Bridge was talking about, and this look to the past. And there's a quote by James Baldwin about our inability to excavate our history from the rubble of romance. And there is this sense about a better time, and and great again, and for whom and in what way. And I think we have to ask ourselves that question and be honest about it. I also believe that ties to, and I've talked to a number of people about a fulsome understanding of our history. And some people say, oh, well, we shouldn't just, keep beating ourselves up for the past. But until we understand our history and how those dots are connected to create our present, we won't be able to create an equitable future. And that future can exist for the broad American community, the pie doesn't have to be so small. We can grow that pie, but to do that requires us to put everyone on the field. It requires us to define the we, and we the people, quite broadly. And one of the things that I often think about, referring to text, there's a book, Strangers in Their Own Land, and the author, who's a sociologist, spent time before the Trump presidency, but trying to study and understand the rise of the Tea Party, and spent time several years living in a small town in Louisiana. And she talks about and summarizes the views of many who became a part of the current president's base, and this sense that people were standing in line, doing the right thing, it was orderly, and the government stepped in and all of a sudden put people in the line ahead of them, put Black people in line ahead of them, put women in line ahead of them, put, the snail darter protected by the EPA in the line ahead of them. And they got shoved to the back, even though they were doing the right thing. I think that calls to question how the line got formed and who was allowed to be in the line. But that's the feeling that exists, and also the role that government plays, and this anger that exists and why it exists toward government. And I think that also is part and parcel, along with the things that Bridge described, as I read and as I understand and as I listen and try to better understand what is happening in our country today. And also, quite frankly, in other countries around the world, though it may look a bit different.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have another, our final question is two parts, so it's a lot to answer in the little remaining time that we have, but it's really important. How do we reconcile the adversarial emphasis of party politics with achieving national solutions that require bipartisan cooperation? The second part is, how do political party leaders overcome fears of self-preservation to meet the other side in common benefit solutions?
Oh man, what wonderful questions. I'd say very quickly, adversarial politics in any enterprise can be great because it can push our thinking, it can surface up the best ideas, it can force innovation and kind of this entrepreneurial spirit. Having worked with a lot of entrepreneurs now, my God, they fight and fail and nudge towards success, and it's just such a wonderful thing. When it becomes personal, becomes the subject of a culture war and a divide among human beings that ought to love and respect one another. I'll never forget, I worked with Ted Kennedy, Mel's old boss, and Orrin Hatch, who had had a 34-year relationship. And you couldn't find more polar opposites in the US Senate, a strong conservative and a strong liberal. And yet they loved each other and they recognized the common humanity, and they came together to pass the National Service Act that Orrin Hatch then names the Edward M. Kennedy Serve America Act on the House floor in honor of his friend, a liberal senator. And he took flack for it back home, but that's the spirit of kind of healthy adversarial politics we need to rescue back.
And I know we're out of time, so I'll make a plug for a book, not mine, make a plug for a book with this point. And Bridge also spoke to this. The challenge really comes when opponents become enemies. And I have seen exactly what Bridge describes, people with very different views, but the ability to work together, to compromise, not a dirty word, for the common good and to move forward. But we are now in a situation where by party, we have become not just opponents, we have become enemies. The book, How Democracies Die, is an interesting study of that by two political scientists who study other parts of the world and turned what they understand in that lens on the United States and the party system in the United States, to explain how parties could actually be gatekeepers. I'd love to talk to them about that. I want to scratch on that some more, given some of the bad things that have happened in smoke-filled rooms, but how parties can become gatekeepers and help to reestablish norms. But there was a pivotal moment, particularly in the 1960s, where we started to sort ourselves in different ways, that party identification started to become cultural identification, and we were no longer just opponents, but we became enemies. So to whoever asked the question, if you haven't read the book, you might find that to be interesting.
Crystal, I know you're closing it out, but after the wisdom and insight and activity of these two great leaders, I believe the democracy still has life. Thank you both so much. It's been inspiring.
Indeed. Thank you, Melody. Thank you, Bridge. Thank you, Steve. What a great conversation. Thanks to our audience. Thanks for all the great questions. All of our community events this summer are free and open to the public. So if you are in a position to donate, please click on the link in the chat. Also, please join us for the rest of our summer events. Upcoming next week, July 28th, the McCloskey Speaker Series will be featuring a discussion on the strides women have made toward gender equality in the last 100 years and what hurdles still remain, featuring Catherine Granger, Ai-jen Poo, and Cecile Richards in the McCloskey Speaker Series. Thanks for joining us.